Hi guys, Talysha from P3 and Foot Pain Explained here. Now today we're going to be talking about when less can really be more in rehab. Now before I get started, just want to let you know that we're in our last few weeks of enrolments being open for our 10-session mentorship, Private Practice Prepared. Now this mentorship is designed for new and recent graduates, be it podiatry or physiotherapy, anyone in allied health who deals with lower extremity musculoskeletal pathologies. Now, over 10 sessions, we cover a range of topics ranging from client communication, treatment planning, exercise prescription, orthosis prescription, footwear recommendations, and even just career planning and personal branding. So if you'd like to find out more about this, and again, we're in our last few weeks of enrollment, head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/prepared and you can find out more. And now we'll get into today's episode. The Progressive Podiatry Project, here to share knowledge, insights and information for you to improve your clinical practice and, most importantly, help you help your clients. So when it comes to rehabilitating musculoskeletal pathologies, it can be very easy for us to fall into the trap of what I call the illusion of action. And that is us feeling like we always have to do something, be it formulate this really elaborate exercise rehabilitation program, or we need to do a footwear prescription, orthosis prescription, jump down some manual therapies, or all of the above. Now, in some instances, this may very well be warranted, but in other instances, sometimes it can actually be the exact opposite of what we need to do. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So using the example of plantar fasciopathy and Achilles tendinopathy, in both of these pathologies we see, or oftentimes we'll see, structural changes to varying degrees affecting the function of an individual. Now, for both of these pathologies, there are a number of common subgroups that the pathology can develop in, and it can develop in younger individuals, older individuals, active people, and sedentary or inactive people. Now, why it's really important to consider these 2 to 4 subgroups that I'm talking about is what's actually contributing to their pathological development, and also what will be needed to treat their pathology will vary between these subgroups. And this is why it's really important for us to have that understanding of, firstly, what contributes to the pathological development in these different subgroups, and then what the different subgroups need to hopefully achieve functional restoration. So before I go too much further into that, I just want to dial it back a little bit and we'll talk about tissue stiffness and compliance. Okay, so stiffness and compliance, it relates to what it's based off as Young's modulus of elasticity. So that's how much load or stress can be applied to a tissue or a structure before deformation occurs. So when we have a tissue that's quite stiff, it can tolerate relatively high degrees of load before deformation will occur. And then if we have a tissue that's more compliant, less load will be required to result in deformation. Now, in pathological presentations, we can see a tissue being too stiff, or we can see it being too compliant. And it also goes into performance, but we'll talk about that another day. But essentially, what can happen is if we've got someone whose tissue is too stiff, we would often want to increase the compliance of that tissue. And then if we've got someone whose tissue was maybe too compliant, we would likely want to increase the stiffness. So how this translates to the plantar fascia and the Achilles tendon is both of these structures, for the most part, serve to store and release elastic strain energy. So if the tissue is too stiff, it can't absorb and release enough elastic strain energy. So what it often does is it places increased stress at its origin, insertions, and surrounding structures. Then, if we've got the tissue being too compliant, then it's not able to basically release that energy or dissipate that energy. It's more absorbed internally, which can cause internal disruption or overload of the tissue. Now, this is a very, very crude definition, and I do go into this in more detail in other blogs and courses and bits and pieces, but just trying to paint a picture. So if we've got someone who is too stiff, like I said, we may want to increase the compliance. Too compliant, we may want to increase the stiffness. Now, different exercise exposures will help lead to those physiological adaptations. But then if we also dial that back and we go back to the subgroups I was just talking about, so if we've got active people, younger people, older people, inactive people. Okay, so when we have our tissue stiffness and compliance, a lot of it is related to our collagen crosslinks, which they're essentially crosslinks. That's what joins collagen fibers to allow it to become stiffer, dissipate load, transmit load. Now, when we age, and then also in the presence of diabetes, we see an increase in tissue stiffness, but it's not necessarily the good kind, because the collagen crosslinks that develop as a result of aging and or diabetes is they're more produced via processes that involve advanced glycation end products or AGEs and other enzyme proteins. But essentially what these do is, yes, they make the tissue more stiff, but it doesn't necessarily make it more load tolerant. So it's like if you picture, say, an elastic band. So an elastic band ideally would be able to store and release a moderate amount of elastic strain energy. But then if we leave that elastic band, say, out in the sun for a couple of days, it becomes a little bit more brittle. So it'll be stiff, but it reaching its sort of failure point of stress actually becomes lower. So again, very crude example, but that's one way that we can potentially visualize what happens in the increased stiffness that comes from aging and or diabetes in relatively inactive individuals, how it can make their tissue more stiff or stiffer than we want. Okay, so that's sort of explaining the stiffness component in some of these subgroups. Now, when it comes to compliance it can occur for a number of reasons. But if we're thinking about a really active individual who may be undergoing some, say, training errors, and they're just not having enough recovery time or adaptation time in between load exposures. So in tendons, often what happens when we're going through that, the pathology continuum that's been described by Jill Cook, where we've got our healthy tendon, we head into tendon reactivity, and then structural changes occur and so on. In that early stage, often what happens when we're loading the tendon, we get an infiltration or an influx of proteoglycans and other proteins. Now, part of the influx, it's considered to be the body trying to sort of protect the tendon, because the influx of proteoglycans. Yes, I am using that word correctly. Sorry, I just had a mental blank. The influx of proteoglycans, yes, they are involved in the tissue repair and remodeling process of the collagen, not type 1 collagen specifically, but a lot of the collagens involved in the tendon. But it also serves in that initial instance to increase the cross-sectional area of the tendon to try and dissipate more load. So it's sort of a reactive protective mechanism. Now, when we have proteoglycans or an influx of proteoglycans in tendon tissue, it actually makes the tendon more compliant. So if we compare ligaments and tendons, for example, so ligaments and tendons are both primarily made of type 1 collagen. That makes up the majority of its dry weight. Now, in ligaments, it has a natural higher concentration of proteoglycans to allow the tissue to be more compliant or viscoelastic. Whereas in tendons, there's less proteoglycan content in healthy tissue because we want it to be a bit stiffer. So if we're having someone who's overloading the tissue, or they're just loading the tissue too frequently, and they're getting this reactivity of the proteoglycan influx to, one, try and increase the cross-sectional area, but it's also there to try and help facilitate the remodeling process of the tendon to allow it to become stronger so it can adapt and continue with its load exposure. But if we're loading it too frequently and not allowing it to settle back to or adapt sufficiently, that can just remain. So we can, and often you'll see that in that mid-portion tendinopathy. So it's more compliant. Okay, so oftentimes what we'll need to do with a tissue that's too stiff is apply certain loads to try and increase the compliance. Now, when we have a tissue that's too compliant, yes, sometimes we do want to apply exercise and load to have the tissue adapt so it can become stiffer. But if we're not allowing sufficient time in between load exposure for that adaptation to occur, and we're just sort of keeping the tendon or fascia in this constant level or state where the proteoglycans and the cellular processes can't complete what they're trying to do, it can remain too compliant. So yes, in some instances, we may want to add load to have the tissue adapt so it can become stiffer. But in other instances, all we need to do is remove some of the load to allow the adaptation to occur so it can just naturally become stiffer, if that makes sense. So hopefully that paints a little bit more of a picture. And we're just going to dive into that a little bit more, and hopefully it makes sense as to why we need to sometimes not do much and what that may look like in our clinical practice. Breaking it down probably a little bit more simply, so that was a whole info dump that I just went through. But if we break it down simply into how we can apply this clinically and help build our clinical reasoning, the first thing that we need to look at is obviously going through someone's clinical history. So how much activity are they doing or have they been doing? Because basically that will help paint a little bit of a picture of where you may need to go as far as applying load or removing load or modifying load. So their clinical history, what they've been doing in sort of the 3 months prior to seeing you. So are they engaging in activity every day? Are they doing activity once a week? That'll help you at least start to have an idea of when to know if you should add load or remove load. But then another thing that we can think about, and this expands on this a little bit more, and it's drawing on the the bone stress injuries. Okay, so I just lost half the sentence in my mind, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so with bone stress injuries, there's essentially two types of bone stress injuries that can occur, and you can have a little bit of an overlap, but for the most part, there's considered to be fatigue-related bone stress injuries or insufficiency-related bone stress injuries. So fatigue-related injuries is where we see excessive or abnormal stress being applied to what would be considered relatively healthy or normal tissue. So the tissue, if we weren't excessively loading it, would probably be fine. And then if we've got insufficiency-related pathologies, that's where we may have a tissue that's insufficient or not as healthy as ideal, just as it is anyway. And then if we apply what would be considered a relatively normal amount of stress, now, yes, this does change from person to person, but if we have normal stress being applied to relatively insufficient tissue or tissue that without this normal stress being applied, it would just be considered histopathologically not ideal. Okay. So if we have someone where it's more of a fatigue-related injury, then we would want to be addressing the stress being applied to it. Then if we have someone where it's more of an insufficiency-related pathology, then we may need to factor in and address what's actually contributing to that tissue being, I'm saying this in quotation marks, insufficient in the first place before we're dealing with the stress, or deal with that concurrently. So if we're looking at this from the lens of, say, plantar fasciopathy, and we have a runner, for example, it may simply be training errors where they're just running too much, they've had a sudden increase in mileage or a decrease in the recovery time between running sessions, whatever it is. So they've just got this tissue that ideally or theoretically is healthy and normal, and then they're just applying too much stress that's outpacing the physiological adaptation that the tissue can undergo. So they're just doing too much. So we may just need to reduce the amount of stress that's being applied. Whereas if we've got an insufficiency related one, so let's just say we've got a relatively inactive, sedentary, older patient who may have diabetes with plantar fasciopathy. So yes, they may have an increase in stiffness in the plantar fascia or Achilles tendon, that's come as a result from changes in collagen cross-links as a result of the advanced glycation end product process. Okay, So for that person, yes, we may know that age has affected the quality of their tissue. The presence of diabetes may also be affecting the quality of their tissue, and it's just decreased its load tolerating capacity. But they're also inactive. So for this person, we may want to apply a lot more frequent, however minor, load exposures to try and address what we can to help increase the sufficiency of the tissue and allow it to tolerate normal amounts of stress. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense, and probably the easiest way to think of it, and there's a lot of nuance with patients, but again, this is just trying to build that thought process with you. So if we're dealing with a fatigue-related pathology, oftentimes reducing or modifying load and allowing sufficient time for adaptation to occur is often all that we need to do. Now, this is where that less is more comes into play. However, if we're dealing with an insufficiency-related pathology, oftentimes increasing load relative to the individual and their needs is what we need to do in that instance. So basically, how this can look and why your clinical history taking is so important is if we picture, we've got, say, the bell curve. Now, down one end of the bell curve, it can be not enough load is occurring. The middle of the bell curve, it can be sufficient load where we're having positive adaptation occurring, or we're just maintaining. So we're not getting any worse, but yeah, it's just a happy place. So physiological loading, where we're doing things that aren't upsetting things, and in the best case scenario, things are getting better. Then we've got too much load at the other end of the bell curve. So this is, again, why our clinical history taking is very important, and then also having an understanding of what's contributing to that pathological process for that individual, and then also playing into and having consideration of what the application of potential load that we may do via an exercise prescription may do. So if we look at the runner, so let's just say that the runner is they're running every day. So, and as we know, when it comes to higher bouts of loading, especially with tendons, but fascia tends to follow the same physiological pathway that tendons do when it comes to remodeling and load and everything like that. So if someone is running every single day and they're having say it's a tempo session or a sprint training session, whatever it is, higher amount of load on that day, we do know that for 24 to 48 hours, that tendon is going to be a little bit weaker because of the process that it naturally follows for adaptation to occur. So that's where we've got our proteoglycans and the remodeling of the extracellular matrix and all of that. But then if we're in that dip where it's a little bit weaker whilst that adaptation is occurring, and then we apply load again, then we move further away from our ideal physiological state. So if we just keep adding exercises on top of that, so if we've got someone that's running 6 or 7 days a week, they've got plantar fasciopathy, or they've got Achilles tendinopathy, and we go, okay, we're going to give you some high load plantar fascia rehab, or we're going to give you some eccentric loaded calf raises, and we're not removing any of the load or modifying any of the load that they're already doing, and then we add that on top, that's potentially just going to increase their symptoms and decrease their functional capacity. However, if we look at the other end of the bell curve with someone who's quite inactive, they might walk once or twice a week, and that may be, so it's that whole if you don't use it you lose it, right? So they might be walking on a Monday, and then Monday, Tuesday, they may have some positive adaptation that occurs, but then they don't do anything until maybe the Saturday or Sunday, and then they may have gone 2 or 3 steps backwards in the physiological process because they've lost some of their adaptation. So for those people, what we may want to do is increase their exposure. So instead of it being once a week or once hardly ever that they're doing it, it may be, okay, we're going to apply load on Monday and then Wednesday or Thursday and then Saturday or Monday. So every 2 or 3 days. Now, again, it's very much patient dependent, and their pain presentation, how they're adapting, it's all very individual. But again, it's just trying to get you thinking about how not everyone needs a specific rehab exercise. Again, sometimes just removing or reducing load, which turns into more of an education session with our patients, is all that we need to do. And it's not uncommon. I can have some days in the clinic where I do very little actual prescription of certain exercises or other interventions. A lot of it, especially when we're coming into the start of running training season, or there's a few events coming up, or the start of sporting seasons like soccer or AFL, where we've just got these massive training load spikes. And a lot of the consultations are education sessions about training load and creating sustainable training habits. But anyway, just trying to get you thinking about that. So in summary, covering all of this off, the really important things that we need to take away as clinicians and think about with each of our patients that are coming in with musculoskeletal pathologies is, firstly, we always need to take a thorough clinical history. That goes without saying for everyone. And then we need to have an understanding of what their individual factors are that are contributing to the presence of their pathology. Have they been doing too much? Have they potentially been doing not enough for too long? That's the problem. Do they have other systemic or health-related factors like diabetes that may be contributing to their pathological presentation, which will potentially impact what we need to do as far as exercise therapies go, or potential external referrals to have someone engage in more regular and frequent exercise activities, or a dietitian to address some of the dietary factors that may be contributing. So many things for that. But essentially, clinical history, getting an understanding of the individual factors that are contributing to their pathology, and then also what their pathological presentation is. So again, is it potentially too stiff? Is it potentially too compliant? Do they maybe need to do more? Do they need to do less? And then if we are looking at prescribing specific exercises for targeted adaptation, we need to have an understanding of what exercises will trigger those adaptations. So for example, like there's so much literature out there, but when we're looking to have type 1 collagen adaptation, either in the Achilles or the plantar fascia, we know that eccentric exercises apply higher degrees of internal stress to the tissue, which promotes more adaptation. But with that, isometrics and concentrics will also lead to some of these changes, but eccentrics just do it a little bit more. And then if we need to increase stiffness further and neuromuscular coordination, then plyometrics might be where we need to go. So it's just having an understanding of what the tissue is doing in its current pathological state, what needs to happen to help try and restore function and reverse the pathological state if you can, via whatever your treatment intervention is. And in the case of exercise therapies, what specific movements or types of load will help trigger those adaptations. So they're essentially the main things that I get the people I'm mentoring, just everyone that's listening basically, hopefully to pay attention to when you're taking your clinical history and reviewing patients with musculoskeletal pathologies. And again, in this case, it's more plantar fasciopathy and Achilles tendinopathy. So hopefully that gives you a decent amount of information to build off, hopefully triggers a couple of light bulb moments for you. Now, if you want some help with writing or formulating your exercise prescriptions, we do have our movement prescription blueprint, which is essentially a document that we've created to try and help guide you through the exercise prescription thought process, especially covering off a few of these factors that we've discussed today. So if you'd like to get a free copy of your blueprint, head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint and you can download it there. That's it for today. I'm Talysha. It's been great. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.